All week we've been commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 mission, which landed men on the moon for the first time in human history and, of course, returned them safely to the Earth. And now a huge part of that historic achievement has been preserved in exact detail.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Stepping into the restored Apollo 11 operations control room, it feels like that message just came over the speaker.
Beautiful view. Isn't that something?
July 20th, 1969, America becomes the first nation to put a man on the moon. And every mathematical calculation, every decision had to be cleared through this room. Apollo 11 flight director Gene Kranz says it feels like he's stepping back in time.
The people that lived here and worked here, the room talks to them.
The $8.5 million project recreated every detail, down to the data on the computer screens, the ashtrays, even a specific crew member's coffee cup.
We had to get the exact colors of coffee cups, even the patterns of coffee cups. The girl that was in charge of this spent hours and hours on eBay and Etsy and in antique shops and thrift stores.
Sandra Tetley, the Johnson Space Center Historic Preservation Officer, says it took her team 6 years to get everything just right, digging through mission control records and the few videos that exist from that day.
You are telling history, so it needs to be exact.
Krantz says it's nearly perfect, and walking into the restored room, he's brought back to the raw emotion of that historic day.
This room was really stirring, and the emotional intensity in this room was, almost overwhelming. It was the kind of thing that it only happens once in your life.
There is, of course, a lot more to the story, almost an unending amount. After the astronauts returned to the Earth, their adventures continued.
After that dramatic splashdown in the Pacific Ocean, there were celebrations in mission control. But what few may remember is what came next.
Now the three men wearing biological isolation garments entered the mobile quarantine facility.
The astronauts were quarantined to protect the planet from any germs they might have brought back from the moon.
Neil, Buzz, and Mike.
Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins greeted by President Richard Nixon. Their three faces pressed against the glass.
And welcoming you back to Earth.
Astronaut Michael Collins would say in an interview years later, all of it might have been for nothing. He said any germs they brought back with them would have escaped the moment they opened that hatch of the Pacific.
Command module lands in the Pacific Ocean, and what do? They open the hatch. You got to open the hatch. All the damn germs come out.
They would stay in isolation for 3 weeks. First in this converted Airstream trailer aboard the USS Hornet aircraft carrier, then transported to Pearl Harbor, then to Houston, where the three astronauts' wives were waiting to finally see their husbands return from the moon.
And joining us now to discuss Apollo 11 and all that we learned from our moon missions is Jack Burns. Jack is a professor of astrophysics at the University of Colorado. He's also director of the NASA-funded Network for Exploration and Space Science. Jack, to a lot of people, the moon landing is just now a fact of life. It's a piece of our history. We've been there and done that. But try and give our viewers some perspective on just how big an event this was in 1969. And if you can think of any equivalent we might someday see in the present era. I'm not even sure a mission to Mars would capture the world's imagination in the same way.
Well, you're absolutely right. It was a world-shaking event. I remember myself, I was 16 years old at the time, gathered around an old black and white television set and watching Neil Armstrong and those first steps on the moon. Everybody that was alive during that time remembers where they were. So maybe the closest might be the 9/11 event here in the U.S. and New York City.
There is some frustration as we look back 50 years later. It turns out the moon was so inhospitable. It's not a viable place for people to live permanently, no signs of life, or even a Rosetta Stone that would unlock the mysteries of the universe. Some people may think that other than the actual landing, the fact of the landing, that it was something of a bust. Was it? What did we learn from our trips to the moon?
Oh, it was far from a bust. It allowed us to learn, for example, how the moon was created by bringing core samples back with the Apollo astronauts. We now know today that the moon was formed as a result of a giant impact about 4.5 billion years ago between a Mars-sized asteroid and the proto-Earth. Then the Earth and the moon were reconstituted from a combination of those two. And that's pretty fundamental because it shaped really what the Earth as well as the moon is and set the stage for life to form on our planet.
Was the Apollo program, especially later in the program, mismanaged? We got a lot of cool gimmicks. We got the moon rover. There was an astronaut who hit a golf ball on the moon. But I'm wondering if NASA, in your mind, made a mistake turning the moon landings into, well, something of a gimmick, for lack of a better term.
Oh, I disagree. I think the later landings were very much oriented towards the science, and the amount of science that was done, lunar geology, was very substantial, as I mentioned before, in understanding really our history and our origins. And it set the stage for now, 50 years later, going back with much more advanced scientific instrumentation to use the moon, in fact, as a kind of history book to better understand our own formation of life and our evolution on this planet.
You mentioned what we learned on the moon about the history of the moon and the Earth and how they were formed. I'm wondering, give me one or two other facts or discoveries that we made thanks to Apollo that impact people's everyday lives in ways they might not think of.
Well, I think that this was really the birth of computer technology. So this was the first time that a landing on the surface of another world was accomplished. And we had very crude computers in those days. The memory, for example, on the computer on board the lunar module was only about 4 kilobytes. Your cell phone today has about 5 gigabytes, or about 1,000,000 times more. But what this did is, in part, as the Apollo helped kickstart really the entire era of advanced computer technology, leading to cell phones and personal computers that we have today. And that's just one example of some of the advanced technology. There's also medical, biomedical sensing, and a number of other things.
Why do you think we haven't gone back in so long?
It's hard and it's expensive. In 1969, 1970, then President Nixon closed down the Apollo program because he felt it was too expensive. It was burning up about 5% of the entire federal budget. Today, NASA's budget is about 0.4%, so almost about an order of magnitude less. And also, there was a concern about safety. Apollo just was barely on the hairy edge of being able to accomplish this with the technology of that day.
In the era since Apollo, NASA's focused more on deep space probes as well as near-Earth tools that can provide lessons about the deeper universe. I'm thinking of Hubble and its successive telescopes. All have been very, very successful. Do we have a strategy today? Does Mars and a mission to Mars help or hurt that probe and near-Earth strategy?
Well, I think today when we think about exploration, both scientific exploration and just understanding our solar system, it's a combination of robots, rovers, and astronauts going to be exploring together. So unlike Apollo, where you had, for example, Jack Schmitt, a PhD geologist on the Apollo 17, the last flight doing classic field geology, in the future, we're going to have robotic rovers commanded by the astronauts and doing advanced gathering of data, information, and helping to guide the astronauts. In many ways, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking Silicon Valley to the moon with us this time around, the kind of things that was not possible in the 1960s and 70s.
Finally, Jack, you're on the NASA Advisory Council. How can we revitalize interest in space and space exploration?
Well, I think to make it exciting to the everyday person, we need to be going to new places we haven't been to before. So Vice President Pence and President Trump have indicated that the 2024 mission, 5 years from now, will involve landing on the South Pole region of the moon, where we know there's water ice. So unlike Apollo, where we thought the moon was bone dry, we now know that there's water there, and that water can be mined to be able to generate things like rocket fuel and the beginnings of a space economy. Those kind of things that will make space travel more practical, more affordable, more economic, and more inclusive of other countries and private companies as well.
Finally, Jack, whenever I talk with other people about space and space exploration, somebody asks me, well, would you go into space? And I say, in a heartbeat. If you offered me a chance to escape the Earth's bounds, would you?
I would love to go to the moon myself. I've been studying it and researching putting radio telescopes on the far side of the moon for over 35 years. So would love to be involved in that project.
So Jack, thanks for a few minutes and happy anniversary to Apollo 11.
Thank you all.
And up next, we shift gears, a heartbreaking story about a migrant family and how tragedy has torn it apart.